The ketogenic diet and metabolic therapies are medical interventions that require guidance from your doctor or care team. If you are taking psychiatric medication, do not make any adjustments without first consulting with your doctor.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be joined today by Hannah Warren. Hannah Warren is a advocate and writer, and she's also the mental health communications and advocacy manager with the Pizzuki Group and Metabolic Mind. And I'm so excited to be talking to her today because she is kind of someone I'm looking up to in this experience of following the ketogenic diet. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and has been using the ketogenic diet and metabolic interventions to treat and manage her illness. So she was diagnosed with bipolar a little over a decade ago and has been using these metabolic therapies for about 2.5 years now, quite successfully. And so I'm so excited to hear more from her and to get to share more with you all about her experience. Before I get into this with Hannah, I just want to also share that you can find more of her writing and content on her website, radiantbeast.com, which we will link to in the description below. So hi, Hannah. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to get an opportunity to share with you. And I couldn't be more enthusiastic about this project you've started. It's going to be such a great resource for people. And I'm really optimistic that you're going to get incredible results from metabolic therapies too.
Thank you. Well, I can't wait to kind of pick your mind about what your experience has been like. So I guess, could we maybe start off with you just sharing a little bit about what your experience with bipolar disorder, getting that diagnosis, and what that experience was like?
Absolutely. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 28, and it came on incredibly suddenly, just seemingly out of nowhere. At the time of my diagnosis, I was actually studying abroad, getting a fully funded scholarship for my master's degree at University of the Arts London College of Fashion. It was funded through Rotary International, and it was a part of a nonprofit that I had started in India that empowered women through giving them employment in garment manufacturing. So at the time, I was a good student, a hardworking person, seemed like I had a bright future ahead of me. Everything was going really well. And I didn't see any signs that I was going to have a full-blown psychotic episode. I had absolutely no idea. I wasn't even seeing a therapist, had no indication that I was going to have mental health problems. And it was interesting because even my mom had come to visit me a few weeks before my episode, and she also saw no indicators, no signs that something was going awry. So I was working on a paper one night, and I don't know how you are as a student, but I used to work on papers all night a lot of the time, right before the deadline, and it would be this creative process. Yeah. Usually I'd just be getting all these ideas and getting excited about the creative process, and I'd finish in the morning and then I'd crash and go to sleep. It was kind of like that I started to work on this paper, but I just never ended up crashing and going to sleep. And I don't really know how many nights I was up straight in my apartment by myself, but I was working on that paper, and I think it was probably 3-4 nights, something like that I just didn't sleep and started to become delusional, started having hallucinations, and eventually stumbled out of my apartment completely in this paranoid and strange state, and ended up eventually being escorted to an inpatient facility there in London, where I ended up staying for more than a month and a half.
Okay. And so was that when you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at the time, the clinicians explained to me that it was likely that I had bipolar disorder. They also said that there was a small chance it was just a fluke. So their advice to me at the time was you should take medication, an antipsychotic medication, for at least 6 months. After that, if you want to experiment with going off of it and seeing if you have another episode, you can, because if it's a fluke, you won't have another episode. You can go on with your life. If you have another episode, you're really going to need to stay on medication indefinitely if you want to stay mentally stable. So I followed their advice, and I was on the medication for 6 months. And like so many people, I had really negative side effects that have to do with kind of the way the medications were impacting my metabolism. And I ended up putting on more than 70 pounds in those 6 months, just dramatic and really overwhelming, of course. So after the 6 months, especially seeing the side effects of those medications, of course, it was like, I need to try and see if I can get off of these and if it was a fluke. So I went off of them, was okay for about a year, and actually worked really hard during that time following a healthy diet and exercising. And I managed to lose all the weight, and I started to feel like my old self again, get my energy back, my enthusiasm for life, my focus, my creativity. And then, of course, within a year, another manic episode struck, full-blown psychosis, another hospitalization. And I had to accept at that time, after getting out of the hospital, that it looks like I have what I was told was a lifelong chronic illness that I was just going to have to manage with medication for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So I guess what did that feel like? Like you had a difficult experience on medication the first time. And so then being told that, okay, this is something that you need to do for the rest of your life beyond this medication that affected your life in that kind of negative way. What was that like?
It was really devastating because, of course, when I started taking the medication, again, the same thing happened. I put the weight right back on despite all the hard work. I also should mention that after both of those manic episodes, I struggled with severe depression for about a year. And that was really suicidal depression. I don't know if you've ever struggled with that as part of your illness, but for me, it was like these suicidal thoughts became incessant. And it wasn't the kind of thing where you're in any kind of control of your thoughts or where it seems logical that I had any good reason to want to end my life. It was more almost like a physical sensation, just an involuntary, visceral thought, just that I kept wanting. It would just occur to me out of nowhere, different ways that I might end my life. And it was really, in many ways, I'm lucky I survived. I think if there would have been any kind of easy way to end my life where I was confident that I wouldn't end up messing up my suicide attempt and being even worse off after that, I likely wouldn't be here today. So, when I got that diagnosis and realized, that I'm going to have to be on these medications despite the side effects, and had to deal with that depression, which eventually, even when I was on the medication long term, it did end. It wasn't as severe, kind of the suicidal ideation, but I got to a point where I was more living in what I would think of as kind of a numb limbo state where I was getting through the days, I was working, but I never felt fully myself again. I always suffered with kind of chronic fatigue and brain fog and didn't feel like my passion for life or my creativity was ever fully restored. I just felt more like a fragment of myself. And that went on for about 7 years when I was just on medication, making it through the day, but really felt like I never got my quality of life back and was, never fully felt physically healthy again. I was obese the whole time that I was on my antipsychotic medication, and really, no matter how much I tried to exercise and eat right, it didn't seem to be able to counter the side effects, the metabolic harm that the medications were doing.
Yeah. So, I guess, when did you hear about keto diet or metabolic therapies, and what was that process like of thinking that you maybe wanted to try that out?
Yeah. So I heard about ketogenic therapy for the first time after my third, and I'm very optimistic, final manic episode. So what had happened was that, after about 7 years of what I described as that kind of numb limbo state, I started working for a nonprofit organization that's called Women's Space that was devoted to women's self-actualization and empowerment programming. And they did a lot of kind of interesting programs around holistic health. And I learned a lot of different things going into depth with meditation and exercise, and was starting to improve my quality of life that way. And I just got this thought, it's been like 7 years. I've been completely stable. I haven't had an episode. Maybe I should try going off of my medication again. So I did that. And I was actually during that time also doing a lot of intermittent and extended fasting, which I knew about the cellular healing that happens with autophagy, which is kind of that just cellular cleansing process that happens. But I didn't know anything about how that could potentially be a treatment for my mental illness. I didn't but I very much instinctively felt that something powerful was happening every time I would fast. And I actually got kind of addicted to it because of that. Like I would immediately feel like a cloud lifted and my cognitive functioning started to come back in a new way. So I very much felt that it was healing for me without knowing that it could be related to my mental illness in any way or knowing any of the science behind it. So that whole year that I was off of medication, I was doing a lot of that, which was powerful and healing. And I was exercising and meditating. But still, at the end of the day, within a year, I ended up having a full-blown manic episode once again. All of that to say, though, I actually think there was some evidence in my experience of that last manic episode that the metabolic therapies I was doing without knowing they were metabolic therapies were healing. Because typically what you hear is that if you're bipolar and keep going on and off medication, each kind of manic psychotic episode tends to get more severe. And in my case, the third episode was actually the least severe of my prior episodes. So I think that kind of demonstrates that there is a healing mechanism in those metabolic therapies. But after I got out of the hospital in that third manic episode, I had been put on medication in the hospital again. And of course, the advice from the clinicians was, you need to really stay on this medication now. But I only stayed on the medication for a couple weeks after getting out of the hospital because I again, in that prior year, had started to lose the weight and fully reclaim my physical health, my mental health, my passion, my creativity. All of those things were coming back. And I just thought, I cannot go through this a third time. I just can't. And it sounds terrible, but I got to the point where I thought I would rather deal with a episodic illness and have those moments of mania and psychosis, but have some actual beautiful moments of joy and quality of life in between. Because I started to think about all the creative people who have bipolar disorder, or who had bipolar disorder, Van Gogh, Emily Dickinson, thinking about, would it have been better if they were medicated and numb and had not given to the world? And I guess I felt like I had just completely numbed out all of my creative energy and been sedated with these medications, and that I'd rather experience quality of life, even if it meant dealing with the risks and the onset of psychosis. But I also thought at that time, well, maybe there's some alternatives that I haven't explored or don't know about. So that's when I started researching, and it was just hours really spent exploring the internet, different modalities, different things that people were recommending that could be used as an alternative. And the only thing that I found that I felt had really credible science behind it, I know you've mentioned as well that some things seem kind of fringe science and don't really make that much sense, don't really have an evidence base. But when I found the work of Dr. Christopher Palmer, the science was so compelling. And not only that, it really fit my own experience when it came to fasting. Dr. Palmer talks about the ketogenic diet working as a fasting mimicking diet, and where you can only fast for a certain fixed period of time, of course, because if you can't fast indefinitely or you will die of starvation, obviously, but you can do the ketogenic diet long term and have that upregulated process of continued autophagy, mitophagy, and mitochondrial biogenesis, which is what Dr. Palmer argues is the main mechanism, is that cellular cleansing process that happens in correcting mitochondrial dysfunction through the ketogenic diet. So when I found that, it was absolutely game-changing for me. I went on the ketogenic diet right after reading about Dr. Palmer's work.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing about your experience with medication. I think it's really powerful to hear from someone like how big of an impact that these medications can have on your quality of life, and that there's big, valid reasons why people don't want to be on them and go off them. And especially in your circumstance where it is more of an episodic thing where you could go for months being well and then an episode hits. Because I think from my experience, I've done the same thing of being like, I don't want to be on these medications. They don't feel good. Maybe I don't need them, XYZ, whatever reason. And it's almost immediate for me that I slip into a psychotic episode. So, but I can see how if there's a prolonged period of wellness and you're feeling really good and you're feeling like yourself before that episode hits, I understand where you're coming from in terms of being like, well, maybe it's worth it to go through these episodes. And so, yeah, I think that just helps build empathy for what these treatments can feel like for people and the negative impacts it can have on a person's quality of life. So I guess next question is, what was the process like? You heard about this research from Dr. Palmer, and you've heard about the ketogenic diet as a metabolic intervention. So what was it like getting started? So you said that you had stopped taking medications a couple of weeks after the hospitalization. So you weren't on medications when you started the ketogenic diet. Is that correct?
Exactly. I was not on medication when I started. I was still a little psychotic when I started the ketogenic diet and was out of the hospital. For me, my episodes are extremely severe, so it takes a while to get back to a normal state. And the real significant difference that the ketogenic diet made for me when I started it was after my first 2 episodes. I had that ongoing deep suicidal depression. This time, my depression only lasted a couple months, and it was much more mild. I really wasn't actively suicidal. There was some depression and some amount of not being able to function normally, just having trouble when I tried to catch up on work or be social. I mean, all of those things took time, and there was still a healing process. But I could feel right away a tremendous difference in my mood when I switched to the ketogenic diet. So I had some immediate antidepressant effects from the ketogenic diet that I think comes from just switching fuel sources to ketones. But then, of course, when it comes to mitochondrial healing, that's a longer process. But overall, I was so grateful for how the ketogenic diet helped kind of lessen that depression, make it a lot more manageable, and allow me to feel better more quickly. And then in terms of my expectations of the diet, I was optimistic because of the science and because of what I had experienced before with fasting, but I was still skeptical, and I'm not sure I entirely thought that it would really help me manage my psychosis and keep me out of the hospital long term. So I still am pinching myself, and every month it still gets more amazing to me because I'm now 2.5 years without medication and without needing to be hospitalized. And from my past experience, that full-blown mania would occur within a year. So it's incredible what this tells me. This actually works. And that has exceeded all of my expectations and is mind-blowing. Not only has it been completely game-changing, transformative for my life, but it's inspired me to want to become an advocate and start working for Metabolic Mind and making this kind of my life mission, because I can't believe there's such a simple, effective way to treat this. And there's so many people suffering who could find this as a more effective treatment that comes with, not really even side effects, more what people call side benefits. It's really enhanced my life in so many ways. And as you mentioned, one of the biggest struggles, especially in bipolar disorder, which you so insightfully mentioned, it is episodic. So there's a lot of reasons people will be like, it's just not worth it to deal with this medication all the time. So that's very common for people with bipolar disorder not to want to stay on medication. Whereas you find something like this diet that's so life enhancing, I have no reason to want to get off of it. And it has allowed me to maintain my mental stability, which is absolutely phenomenal. And, it's one of those things, I guess, it's more likely someone could say with treating, mild depression or anxiety that the keto diet is kind of a placebo. Well, when you're someone like me who has dealt with having your brain hijacked, going into psychosis, that family can see you are not even yourself. You're in another world. You don't even understand that you're sick. When a diet is correcting that, you really can't write it off as a placebo effect. Something fundamental, physiological is happening to make that possible, right?
Yeah. I think like starting this process, I'm kind of in the position of just not really being able to wrap my mind around the fact that a diet or these lifestyle changes could have that profound of an impact on something that has kind of rocked my life. You know, you described psychosis as being like a really, really difficult, completely mind-altering experience. And it's hard for me to be like, yeah, if I make these lifestyle changes, that won't be something I need to deal with anymore. And that won't be an experience that I need to struggle with anymore. That's hard for me in the beginning phase without going through it myself to wrap my head around. But, you know, hearing from people like you and others who have gone through this and have their lives have been completely changed is really encouraging. And I'm super optimistic about this. So thank you for sharing the
Do you
benefits.
mind telling me a little about, because this is always so interesting to talk for me to talk to other people who've experienced psychosis, and you know, it's not a lot of the population. I haven't even talked to that many people who can relate to that experience, because if you've never been through that, it's very hard for someone else to even imagine what that's like.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about your experience with psychosis and how that, I think especially, how has it impacted your sense of self and your perception of life and who you are and what you want to do with your life?
Wow, good question. I think that when people hear about psychosis, they often think that, you know, it's very clear that the person is detached from reality in some other, you know, dimension or whatever it may be. And it's a very easy to distinguish experience, but that hasn't been my experience. When I'm in psychosis, it's kind of like everything is different, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And everything just feels a little bit scary. And that's my experience of like this altered reality where I'm not connected to what is really going on. And I'm experiencing something completely different, but I can't quite put my finger on what exactly is happening. And going through that multiple times in my life has really kind of messed up my sense of who I am and my reality and stuff. And that's been something that I've really struggled with, you know, piecing back together every time a psychotic episode happens and kind of coming back to figuring out who I am and what my experience of the world and reality is. I think that that's a really hard thing to kind of piece together after a psychotic episode. I don't know if that's been your experience as well.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like it's your whole sense of self and your understanding of reality is just like put in a blender, and you're like, what is the meaning of life? Almost, I think in some ways it's created a bit of an existential crisis, because when I'm in psychosis, what I'm experiencing felt so real, even though it wasn't.
Yeah.
And it just, but I feel that now finding these metabolic therapies and being able to restore my mental and physical health has really changed the way I look at the whole thing, in the sense that I do feel like I'm more of a seeker of truth. Like, I do think it's made me question reality and made me want to do practices like meditation and try to understand, you know, as funny as it sounds, the meaning of life, because obviously that's something nobody can really explain. But I think in some ways it's created a really positive journey for me at this point, because I wouldn't be able to look at my illness, I don't think, in such a positive way if I wasn't in remission. But now that I'm in remission and feel that I'll have my lasting stability along with my quality of life, it allows me to think that it's interesting to question reality and to be able to be a deep thinker. And I think that's actually beneficial in some ways now.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's allowed you a different perspective on the experiences you've been through, and that's kind of cool. So I guess we wanted to ask you, you know, a lot of people kind of come down on the ketogenic diet for being a really, really hard intervention. And I think that's maybe a big part of why a lot of medical professionals kind of don't offer it to people, because it's seen as too hard or whatnot. So what has your experience been like? Has it been hard to implement? Or what was the hardest part? Or what's your experience with that?
For me, I actually have not found it very difficult at all. I think part of that, you know, I had been doing, as I mentioned, a lot of intermittent and extended fasting. So extending extended fasting could be a period of 3 days, a week, long fasts. So that really helps you sharpen your willpower. And going into the ketogenic diet, after you've conquered that, it feels relatively easy to do a ketogenic diet. I'm a vegetarian and dairy free. When I started, I was vegan, but I decided to incorporate eggs. So incorporating eggs was very helpful for me. They're very nutritious and satiating. So I'm glad I was able to do that. The biggest struggle for me was with that vegetarian, dairy-free keto. Obviously, my choices were very limited. So I had to get used to cooking in that way. And it felt restrictive at first. And it makes it my social life when it comes to going out to eat at different restaurants, things like that are more challenging. But that being said, the incredible benefits I've gotten compared to those minor challenges make it 100% worth it. As I said before, It's almost hard to believe that a treatment for this could be so simple. When you talk about the difficulties, on one hand, comparing it to having to accept never really being physically healthy, dealing with obesity, fatigue, brain fog, compared to, giving up cupcakes, it's really not a hard choice for me. Not much of a dilemma there.
Yeah. Do you feel any sense of, anger or resentment at the fact that no one within the medical profession suggested this type of intervention for you? Because it sounds like my experience has been just really offering interventions like medication or even ECT. And those are really kind of it in terms of what's been explored for me with medical professionals. And so I don't know if that was your experience as well, but what are your feelings around that in terms of not having been offered this as a huge life-changing thing?
Definitely. Well, I'm absolutely not angry at individual clinicians for not offering it, because I know it's just a matter most of the time of people not being aware that this is even an option. And of course, now part of what we're doing at the Bazooki Group is creating that strong evidence base through running trials and randomized controlled trials that's going to help clinicians say this is absolutely an evidence-based treatment that we can provide responsibly. So there's a lot of clinicians who are going to want to wait for the science to catch up, and they're not going to be cutting edge enough, forward thinking enough to start offering this intervention now. Of course, I wish everybody would do that. And I admire all the clinicians who are out there wanting to provide these treatments right now and aren't waiting for the evidence to catch up. But I will say I get aggravated overall at the healthcare system and the idea that so many people have been complacent with offering these substandard treatments and not seeking out better approaches. And that's also why I admire, Dr. Palmer so much as somebody who said, this is not good enough. And how do we really investigate even beyond just the ketogenic diet, but how are we going to look for root causes, physiological causes, to actually provide that precision psychiatry and treat individuals, realizing this is a physiological illness. And this idea that for so long, every diagnosis, it's been written off, it's this arbitrary DSM-5 label with no physiological root we can point to, no way to say what's causing such debilitating illnesses, and kind of writing almost like society has written off people with mental illness as intrinsically flawed individuals, some way to blame for their own symptoms, instead of saying, look, we need to investigate. We need to find out physiologically what is going wrong with people and provide comprehensive and effective treatments that are empowering and allow them to lead full, healthy lives.
Yeah.
So more than anything, I'm not angry at individuals. I'm angry at the complacency, though.
Yeah. I think, maybe that's what I'm feeling as well. And I love what you just described there in terms of it makes sense to look for the physiological reason this is happening and to try to work on that instead of just chalking it up to, I don't know, your brain is ill, mental illness. Like that doesn't feel good to me, that's where it stops. And you mentioned in a different interview. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, and this is actually, I do have a question for you related to this next point that made me think of. I think mental illness can get complicated because there is a clear link with trauma. So a lot of the times it seems that people's life experiences and their diagnosis are entangled, and it's hard sometimes. Even people with lived experience have told me that the idea that this is just biological or physiological writes off their own individual experience and the trauma that kind of shaped them. And it's interesting, if you read Brain Energy, Dr. Palmer does talk about the link between trauma and metabolic dysfunction and how trauma actually does impact the body and metabolic function. So those things can be very much connected. But for someone like me, I think it's easier to see that the biological cause, because I had a pretty happy life prior to my diagnosis. Of course, there was so much trauma that I went through as a result of becoming ill when it came to the forced medication, the hospitalization, the delusions, suicidality, and then just kind of living with a diminished quality of life. But it's such a clear cutoff point to what was a pretty happy, healthy life to all of a sudden having this disabling illness. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if you've experienced any trauma, or if your life experiences have at all shaped the way that you interpret your illness.
Yeah. I mean, I think my understanding of trauma is that it has a physiological effect as well. Like you're mentioning, Dr. Palmer's work indicates that it affects, your metabolic health as well on a cellular level. And so I think, I understand that trauma that I've experienced in my life has altered, not only my mental state, but, my biology and the way this illness shows up in my body. But I think largely, like I have experienced some trauma early on, but largely I had a similar experience to you where I had a fairly good upbringing. I was living a fairly, good, healthy life. So it does feel more biological, but I do understand the trauma element affecting the biology as well. And so I think that it still makes sense, even when we incorporate trauma in the dialogue or the discussion around mental illness, it still makes sense that there's still this physiological element at play that's being affected by environmental factors, such as your experience with trauma and stuff like that as well.
I think the way that Nicole Laurent, the therapist, describes this, I know you've been speaking with her as well, and she's absolutely wonderful. She talks about how, talk therapy is always beneficial, but when she sees patients who start to implement metabolic therapies and really deal with that biological component, it often makes things like talk therapy so much more effective, because all of a sudden they're stabilized and then they're able to do that deeper work that's required to move forward as you're healing. So I think it's important to note that metabolic therapies, ketogenic therapy, it's not a silver bullet that if someone has a lifetime of complex trauma, they're going to start ketogenic therapy and all of a sudden be better. But it does stabilize people so that then they can start working through that trauma and trying to reshape, reframe their lives narrative and move on in a more healthy and a productive way. So even for someone like me who didn't have kind of complex childhood trauma, I still had a lot of things to work through that were a result of my illness. And ketogenic therapy didn't magically fix that, but it's allowed me to work on those things in a much more productive, impactful way, if that makes sense.
I think that's probably an important distinction, is that it's not that the ketogenic diet just solves all the problems and is just this miracle, your life will be better, but it provides kind of a groundwork for you to be able to work on other elements of your life, because you're not dealing with symptoms or you're not burdened with the things that weigh you down in terms of a chronic illness like bipolar or schizophrenia.
Exactly. That's a great way to say it.
So I guess just a couple more questions for you. So I'm starting this out and I'm getting a lot of, sharing with people that I'm starting the ketogenic diet, and I'm being met with, well, are you trying to lose weight? Is that, what was your experience of telling people that you're trying out the ketogenic diet for your mental health? What was the reception to that like?
Well, when I started, I did still have some weight to lose, which was great. I had that full body fat that I could convert into ketones, lots of stored energy there at my disposal. So, so I think people weren't critical of that, saying, well, you don't need to lose weight, so why are you doing it? Because I still did have a bit of weight to lose. But I feel that overall people were supportive of my ketogenic diet. And it was kind of nice that I was able to be so strict about it, because people didn't even ever try to pressure me to eat differently. At work, for example, we'd have parties and there'd be lots of treats. Nobody was going to pressure me to eat something because they understood that I was black and white about this. Like, I was not going to waver from my diet at all.
Yeah. I think, my experience has then been that a lot of people who I tell I'm starting the ketogenic diet don't really understand the like therapeutic element of it and using it as a treatment for mental illness. It just kind of seems like a bit of a fringe diet to lose weight. And that's kind of the societal understanding of it.
I started ketogenic therapy, and not too long after I started a new job. So I actually wasn't very open with people. I told them it was a medical intervention, but I never got into the details of what I was treating. At that time, I was still a little afraid of the stigma because I was starting a new position, and I felt like if this was out there, people might question my capabilities and it might impact the way I'm perceived at work. And eventually that changed because I worked for an amazing nonprofit hospice organization with the most incredible, compassionate coworkers. So over time, I did open up about my illness and what I was treating, and was met with so much wonderful love and support. It was really phenomenal. But I was always careful to explain to people. I think one of the biggest misconceptions with this is that it's about nutrition. So a lot people have literally said to me when I told them about ketogenic therapy for mental illness, oh, that's just common sense, healthy diet, exercise, sleep makes sense. But I have to stop them there and say, this is not just about weight loss or nutrition. The ketogenic diet is a strong physiological intervention that changes the fuel source of your brain and works on a cellular process by fixing mitochondrial dysfunction, and really emphasizing that distinction, and that this is something that really changes your body chemistry and has a substantial impact. It's very different than the idea of just a healthy diet.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it. I'll use that when I'm explaining to people. Thank you. So I guess just to kind of wrap things up, what advice would you give someone who's starting out with the ketogenic diet and the means to treat their mental illness?
For anyone who wants to use this diet to treat their mental illness, I think, first of all, it's important to say there's a lot we're trying to figure out in terms of responders versus non-responders and how much it's going to impact someone. But I think that there's every reason to be optimistic. I know that, even if it is determined that only a third of people with mental illness are going to respond to ketogenic therapy, I would have absolutely tried it either way because the potential returns were so great. And so I think it's always worth trying. Thinking about this question, I want to ask you specifically, because I think the kind of advice you would give for someone starting the ketogenic diet would depend on the individual and what kind of challenges they were facing and what their attitude was about doing this form of treatment. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the challenges you anticipate, and what kind of support do you envision yourself needing as you start ketogenic therapy?
Yeah. So I'm very grateful that my partner, Rob, is going to be doing the ketogenic diet with me. I think that that's really going to help me be able to stick to it and, have that support within my household. In terms of challenges, I also have 3 kids. And so I'm going to be needing to make them meals that I can't eat. And so that's going to be maybe a little bit difficult to navigate in terms of, I don't know, temptation or just the load of always having to make a couple meals at a time. Another thing that I'm a little bit worried about is I run a lot. And I know that you shared that you are also a runner. So I would love to hear more about how you navigate that. But, I've been taught this whole time in my running journey that, carbs are really, really important in terms of fueling for your running. And, that's been my experience too. I've needed to take in carbs and refuel afterwards. And so I'm a little worried about how that is going to go. I think from an endurance perspective, the ketogenic diet lends itself well to kind of lower like zone 1, zone 2 exercise or whatever, because you can just burn fat. That's fuel. But for the more anaerobic, faster running and whatnot, I'm not sure how that's going to go. So those are kind of the biggest parts where I'm not really sure how it's going to go and I feel it might be challenging, but yeah.
Well, I will say one thing that was easier for me is that I don't have any children, so it's just me. I can see how that would be a challenge, but knowing your mindset and how you're going into this, I think it's really strong because I know you're focusing on metabolic therapies and not just ketogenic therapies. So you've mentioned things like journaling. I feel things like journaling. I don't know. Have you ever meditated? Do you have a meditation or mindfulness practice at all that you do?
I don't know.
I would personally say that things like journaling and a meditation practice could really help you, especially when it comes to strengthening willpower around this diet, which I think is going to be a little bit harder for you than it was for me because you're always going to be confronted with temptation to a certain extent if you're preparing meals for your kids, which makes it a little more difficult. Of course, I was around that sometimes too, just socially, but not as much since I live alone. But there's a lot of evidence around how meditation visualization practices can reinforce behavior change that you're trying to make. One of the visualization practices I have done before that really can help is really just visualizing in detail what you're trying to accomplish. And when a challenge comes, picturing in your mind different ways you could respond to that challenge that would reinforce the choices that you want to make. I think that can be really interesting. So, for example, you could sit there and visualizing whatever your weakness is. Say it's a piece of chocolate cake. Visualize yourself seeing that piece of chocolate cake and coming up with what your alternative response strategy would be. So I'm going to see chocolate cake. I'm going to leave the room and I'm going to have a sparkling water at that moment. And then I'm going to do 10 jumping jacks and close my eyes and remember why I'm doing this therapy. So the idea of visualizations to strengthen behavior change to me is really strong and helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea to just kind of have practices where you can kind of recenter and refocus on why you're doing this and why it's so important to kind of get back on track whenever there's temptation or whatever it may be.
Oh, yeah. And I know you're also giving up drinking as a part of this. And that in and of itself can be quite a challenge for people. I had given up drinking a year before starting my ketogenic therapy, so it was helpful that I already gave it up. But I was someone who used alcohol sometimes as a form of self-medication, when I was less satisfied with my life. So some things that helped me cut out drinking, like most people, I liked the rituals of like relaxing after work and having multiple glasses of wine. Things that I've done is just finding other practices and way to relax and enjoy life in the evening. And this is maybe a little cheesy, but I have some like fancy lights I turn on sometimes that are very soothing and pretty. So just finding ways to replace your rituals. So I turn on those soothing lights and drink some tea, hot bath with candles and music. Just finding little substitutes, I think sometimes is also helpful.
Yeah, that's a good idea in terms of figuring out what the maybe less positive behavior you were doing was giving you and trying to find alternative ways to still get that effect without engaging in the negative, whether it's drinking or whatever it may be. That's helpful. Thank you.
Exactly. That's the perfect way to put it. And when it comes to the running, you need to get, of course, like advice from a clinician with experience in metabolic therapies to understand how you may or may not be able to supplement with carbs like right before a workout, because obviously I cannot give you clinical advice like that, and I'm not sure. I will say at this point in my journey, about 2 years in is when I started to sometimes do a little bit of carb loaded days, like not very often. I'm still in ketosis the majority of the time, and I get into deep ketosis often because of intermittent fasting. That's something that I've kept up with. But now sometimes, especially before a long workout or a day where I'm planning on doing more weights or taking a longer jog, I will eat some healthier carbs beforehand. But again, this can be very different for different people. And I have heard of people using ketogenic therapy who will have immediate severe mental symptoms if they get off of the diet at all. So I think there's a lot of tailoring to the individual. And it's interesting. There are some people I know even who've been using ketogenic therapy to treat a mental health condition for like 5 years, and still they will get mental symptoms right away if they eat carbs. So I think it seems to vary greatly with individuals.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to explore. And actually, I met a nutritionist who specializes in keto for athletes. So I'll be consulting with her more, and hopefully we'll be able to share that information with everyone as well.
That will be so useful for me too. I'll be very interested to hear what she has to say. And as a runner, for me, when we talk about positive behaviors and ways to use alternative things, like running is my go-to de-stressor. After I gave up drinking and everything, for me, that's just what I'm going to do when I need to clear my mind. And I really love that runner's high. So that's something I cherish so much. But I love to run outside just in scenic areas and just enjoy it. I've never been competitive with it. I don't even try to really run fast. I'm not competitive with myself. I've never done races or marathons or anything like that. It's just a process for enjoyment. So when I never did get off of the ketogenic diet, when I was fully in ketosis all the time for those 2 years, I still ran regularly and never had any problems with it. I enjoyed it, never felt overly fatigued or tired from it. But again, I also wasn't trying to perform or get to a certain time, and that might be different for you.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to exploring it and seeing what's possible with the keto diet while still maintaining running. Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. It's been so wonderful getting to chat with you. I just want to remind everyone that you can find more of Hannah's writing and content and whatnot on her website, which is radiantbeast.com. Again, we'll link to that in the description below. But thank you so much, Hannah, for being vulnerable, sharing your experiences, both with living with bipolar, your experiences treating it with the keto diet and other metabolic therapies. It's been so wonderful getting to chat with you, and I hope we'll be able to chat more throughout this process as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just incredibly grateful that you're doing this project. So many people lack resources to learn more and understand about this therapy and get the support that they need to implement it. So I think what you're doing is going to be really invaluable to so many people on their journeys. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. All right. Well, take care, Hannah. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.